Connie, before the break, you were just starting to get into how we have dealt or not dealt, as it were, with the gang problem. You were starting to make the distinction between gang crime and gang culture. Please resume.
Our primary response to the violent gang problem has been one of crime, and it is a serious crime problem, and obviously suppression and the war on gangs, and we've had a mass incarceration strategy that's gone with that. You try to lock up as many of them. The cops are sent out there to play whack-a-mole, and you try to do dragnets and everything else to try and stop this as a crime problem. But there is a fundamental difference between gangs as a crime problem and gang culture. Gang crime, which we always want to reduce, is a law enforcement priority. It should be. But you can't arrest your way out of this problem. And that's what, when we're working with Chief Bratton and Sheriff Baca and Wes McBride, who was a gang officer for a long time. He was one of our consultants, also with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. That was a fundamental breakthrough, that when the officers in L.A. County decided, we agree, we can't arrest our way out of it, we had a breakthrough in L.A. County. And now everybody's on the same page saying that you have to have strategic suppression, not blanket dragnet suppression, but strategic, smart suppression, law enforcement, married to comprehensive prevention, comprehensive intervention, comprehensive reentry for people coming out of prison, as well as community development, and then finally, cultural transformation. You have to have, so it's a public health model. We call it the comprehensive wraparound strategy. You have to go after it like a public health epidemic that it is, and suppression is a very key part of that. You cannot do intervention and prevention in a war zone, so you have to have strong law enforcement. But after that, the officers can't be the only ones dealing with this problem. You have to have the entire community organized to address the ecosystem that incubates the violence.
Alex Alonso, we've been talking in this conversation primarily about Los Angeles because, as we all know, the problem is so bad here and across the country. We are known, unfortunately. I get it all the time when I travel. There's always a joke or a comment made about the gang violence, the Bloods and the Crips out in California, out in Los Angeles specifically. But we know that we are not the only city, the only megalopolis in the country that has this problem. Help me understand what there is for us here in Southern California to learn and or to teach other cities, other communities across the country listening to this conversation that deal with this problem as well.
Well, I think the first thing, if we listen to Connie just now, is that suppression alone is not going to be the answer. That was the approach we did in the 80s. Every weekend, every month, it was a sweep. It was 4 officers in a car arresting just about anyone that was hanging out in public. And years later, we could look back at that and say, what was the result? The result was you made the gangs more cohesive. You created that us against them attitude even stronger. And 10, 15 years later, you have just as much crime. And in certain years, you have even more crime. So other cities that are seeing the gang problem starting to develop, they should look at what L.A. did in the 80s and say, we don't want to do that. We see how that backfired on that city. And read Connie's report and look at what the chief and the sheriff is doing to try to mitigate violence. The attitude we had in the 80s was we want to get rid of the gang. We've learned that you can't get rid of the gang, but what you could do is try to mitigate the violence that some gang members commit. So you have to look also, we've been painting a broad brush on a gang. And if you look at any particular gang in Los Angeles, you're only going to find a small cohort of its members that are involved in serious criminal repetitive activity. The far majority of the gang, they're just there for the ride. They're just hanging out, they're socializing, and then you ask why. It's because they went to kindergarten with these guys. They all grew up together, and some of the gang takes a different route that's more violent, and a majority of them just hang out because they're their friends. And we're trying to police the entire gang as if they're all doing the same thing. And now what LA's doing is focusing on that core violent group.
Help me understand then how you separate, divide, and conquer, if you will, by focusing laser-like attention on that criminal element of the gangs. Since they see themselves, as I take it at least, as all part of family. How do you divide and conquer that family?
It's about gathering intelligence, and law enforcement is doing a better job in Los Angeles doing that. They've identified who are the drug dealers, who are the repetitive shooters, who are the ones that are involved in more violent activity, because we don't have a lot of resources in Los Angeles. So they're going to use those resources and gather intelligence and just go after those in an effort, hopefully, that the guys that do hang out with those will see that they've arrested all the violent guys, and it will reduce the violence amongst that one particular gang.
Sergeant Valdamar, I could take what Connie said earlier in this way. When she talked about the distinction between gang culture and gang crime, one could argue, theoretically at least, that if there is no gang culture, there is no gang crime, that the culture leads to the crime. Gang crime, a priority of law enforcement. but whose priority is it to stop the gang culture? But what I think I hear Connie suggesting to me, whether she intended to or not, is that if the community stamped out the gang culture, it might not lead to gang crime, and your job might be easier. Yes?
You can go to just about any liquor store, pizza place, or even department store, and you can find a gumball machine when you first walk in. And if you look at that gumball machine, you're going to see the homies for sale. You're going to see stickers about drugs. You're going to see gang paraphernalia, tattoos and stuff for sale to very young kids, and they're being indoctrinated with this gang culture. But I wanted to say that the gangs that I'm talking about are criminal gangs. So by their very nature, they commit crimes, even if that's just jumping in other gang members. Mm-hmm. The culture that Ms. Rice is talking about, that wannabe culture, is something that sociologists attach to people who associate with gangs, not necessarily members. Once you join a gang, you are going to be expected to commit the criminal acts that gang commits for the furtherance of the gang. That's the definition of a gang. They have no hierarchy, very loose hierarchy. That's why the Los Angeles model is so hard to stop, because in Chicago-based gangs, they do have a hierarchy. In New York-based gangs, they do have a hierarchy, but not in Los Angeles. We have a cell-like structure of cliques that unite together to form the group. We had the most successful gang program in the United States. I was one of the original 12 members of that group. It was called the Operation Safe Streets, which was a surgical attack against gangs. We actually eliminated gangs in the city of Compton. At that time, the CV3 gang was wiped out for a time, the Paragon gang, the Palm and Oak Crips. So the gang program can actually do away with gangs. Of course, you need community involvement. But what happens is the politicians become involved, and they care more about how they look on the 5 o'clock news than actually impacting the gang problem. So what OSS has evolved into is this, saturation bombing of a community that leads to this hostile environment.
Let me jump in on that note, Connie, because I want to ask you, to what extent those who think they are helping have really, in fact, been hurting. And what I mean to suggest by that is we live in a country, certainly, in a body politic where the way to get elected and to stay elected is to appear tough on crime. And from Washington all the way down to state capitals, down to cities like Los Angeles and beyond, there is this notion of being tough on crime. So for those who may even be well-intentioned, who think they're helping, have they also been hurting, really?
Yes, they've been hurting because they've taken the easy way out in posturing, taking pictures with machine guns and surrounding themselves with officers and chiefs and sheriffs. And then they put out their little mailers and they go on to the next office. This problem cannot be solved with law enforcement alone. We've spent about $20 billion in L.A. County over the last 30 years on trying to get rid of gangs. We have 6 times as many gangs and twice as many gang members. The sergeant is absolutely right that a surge and purge law enforcement strategy can always get rid of a particular clique or stop, you arrest all of the head honchos and shot callers and it goes out of business for a while, but guess what? It grows right back. What I'm talking about is there is a petri dish that transmits this mentality in this culture. When you've got kids who are unsupervised, don't have a lot of activities, don't have strong family structures, don't have the value systems, guess what? They fill that vacuum with whatever's in their neighborhood. And what they see, who are the men who have power? Who are the men who have girls? Who are the men who have cars? And if they can't read, they're not going to look at you, Tavis, or you, Alex, or you, Sergeant, for how to be a good man. And their fathers are not there. That's probably the most common denominator. So here's the deal. I think that what we're talking about, when we talk about success, we're talking about preventing the following. When I interviewed a Los Angeles Sheriff's deputy for this report, he said, "Lady, I used to hate you because you sued us. But let me tell you something. You do this report and I'm going to help you. Here's why. I just arrested the grandson of the man I arrested when I first came out of the Sheriff's Academy 30 years ago.
Wow.
And I arrested his father 15 years ago. So that's 3 generations. That's what I'm talking about, the transmission of the gang mindset and the gang culture. We haven't broken that cycle. That's not law enforcement's job. I think law enforcement has done what it's supposed to do. The rest of us have been AWOL.
Alex, as I listen to Connie and to you and to Sergeant Valdamar, with all due respect to John McCain and Barack Obama, I'm not sure that they get this. I'm not sure how well versed they are on this. Consequently, I'm not sure that this issue, as important as it is going to find its way anywhere on the political radar, get any kind of traction in this election season. Am I wrong about that?
You're absolutely right. And this is the political conundrum. This is also where we've been derelict. How in the world do you allow a culture like this to get to the point where our kids have post-traumatic stress syndrome from being in a cauldron of neighborhoods with violence this virulent? They've got PTSD that's higher than our troops returning from Iraq. We have a homicide epidemic. Our kids are killing each other over tennis shoes, dissing somebody, looking at a girl wrong. We let this culture mushroom to a lethal point. Why? Because they're not our kids. These people don't matter. And you're not going to find Obama, McCain, or anybody else talking about them. And this is the political conundrum. This is the deal we've made, Tavis. We have said as long as people like us are safe in our neighborhoods, contain the violence in the ghettos and the barrios. And we don't need to look at it.
I guess the question, Alex, is long-term, can you contain it?
No, you can't contain it. You know, we've had gangs in this country going back to the colonial times. Even throughout the 1800s, we had gangs. So here we are talking about the same problem we had over 100 years ago, and we're trying to contain it and get rid of it, and it's not going to work. We have to approach it differently. And from Washington, D.C., you're not going to hear anything from that. The last time anyone from Washington, D.C. talked about anything in L.A. was Clinton, who was the first president actually to say Bloods and Crips in an address, and it was all about suppression. It was all about knocking down their houses. It was about mass arrests and raids all across the country. But I think this political cycle, it has to be somewhat mentioned because we're starting to see not just gangs, but L.A.-style gangs pop up in more cities than ever before during this time period that we're in right now, all across this country and throughout the world, in South America, Central America, in Europe, and Africa. L.A.-style gangs are popping up everywhere. So how can you ignore this problem? I have no idea, but it has to be addressed from Washington, D.C. at some point.
What is the reason for these persons adopting as their model the L.A.-style gang?
Well, I believe these cities and these countries have their own issues with poverty and the same type of issues of dysfunctionality that we have here in Los Angeles. But those youth, they want quick respect. They want immediate recognition. And because of the mass media of Los Angeles gangs through hip-hop, through rap, through videos, those kids look at it as a quick way to get legitimized and get respect instantly.
Connie, to give you the last word, my time is up here. If I am a voter and I want to keep my ear attuned to Obama and McCain, just in case they decide to say something about this between now and November, what should I be listening for with regard to what I want to hear them say about how to approach and attack this problem?
Let's get unstuck on stupid, because we're stuck on stupid. Here's how you do it. We're going to move with strategic suppression, but we are going to create in these communities the kinds of conditions that make kids make a different choice. We've got to break the transmission of the gang mentality from one generation to the other, and you cannot do that with just law enforcement. And law enforcement is really waking up, and they're starting to work with community organizations, organize the schools, the entire neighborhood to keep the kids safe 24/7. That's how you start to break this with a comprehensive strategy.